My fiancé hid his affair with my sister until I found their texts. I thought I had everything figured out at 28. The engagement ring on my finger sparkled every time I moved my hand, and I'd catch myself staring at it during boring meetings at work. My fiancé had proposed 6 months ago during a weekend getaway to the mountains, and we'd been planning our spring wedding ever since. The venue was booked, the dress was ordered, and my sister had even agreed to be my maid of honor despite her usual reluctance to participate in what she called traditional nonsense. My sister was 3 years younger than me, but she'd always been the rebellious one in the family. While I followed the conventional path of college, steady employment, and now engagement, she bounced between different cities, different jobs, and different relationships. She'd moved back home about 8 months ago after another failed venture in Los Angeles, claiming she needed to reset her life. My parents were thrilled to have both their daughters nearby again, and I'd been genuinely happy to reconnect with her after years of scattered phone calls and occasional visits. The first few months after her return were actually wonderful. We'd grab coffee on weekends, she'd help me with wedding planning, and she seemed to get along great with my fiancé. He'd always been charming and social, so it didn't surprise me that he could make conversation with anyone. They'd joke around during family dinners, and he'd even helped her move some furniture into her new apartment downtown. I remember feeling grateful that the two most important people in my life were getting along so well. Wedding planning consumed most of my free time, and I threw myself into every detail with the kind of obsessive energy that probably annoyed everyone around me. I created spreadsheets for everything, from seating arrangements to flower arrangements. My fiancé seemed less interested in the details, which I attributed to typical guy behavior. He'd nod along when I showed him centerpiece options or discussed catering menus, but his attention always seemed to drift elsewhere. I told myself that as long as he showed up on the day, the rest was just logistics. The strange behavior started subtly. My fiancé began working late more frequently, claiming new projects at his office required extra hours. He'd come home exhausted and distracted, barely engaging in conversation about wedding plans or anything else. When I'd suggest we grab dinner or watch a movie together, he'd beg off, saying he needed to catch up on sleep or finish work emails. His phone, which used to sit casually on countertops and tables, suddenly became an extension of his hand, always face down and always within arm's reach. I noticed my sister had become similarly elusive. Our regular coffee dates became sporadic, with her canceling at the last minute due to sudden work commitments or mysterious appointments. When we did manage to spend time together, she seemed nervous and distracted, constantly checking her phone and cutting conversations short. She'd lost interest in wedding planning discussions, claiming she was too busy with her own life to focus on my upcoming nuptials. The distance between all of us felt like a slow-burning fire that I couldn't quite identify or extinguish. Family dinners became awkward affairs where my fiancé and sister barely made eye contact, while I chattered nervously to fill the silence. My parents noticed the tension too, asking me privately if everything was okay with the wedding plans. I assured them that pre-wedding stress was normal, but privately I wondered if my fiancé was having second thoughts about our relationship. My suspicions began to crystallize about 3 months before the wedding. I'd been feeling increasingly isolated and confused by the behavior of the two people I cared about most. Late-night wedding planning sessions became solitary affairs, and I started to resent the way my fiancé would disappear into his phone the moment he walked through the door. The excitement I'd felt about our future together was gradually being replaced by a gnawing anxiety that something fundamental was wrong. One evening while my fiancé was in the shower, his phone buzzed repeatedly on the nightstand. Usually I wouldn't have paid attention, but the frequency of the notifications seemed unusual. Without really thinking about it, I glanced at the screen and saw a series of text previews that made my blood run cold. The messages were from my sister, and even the partial glimpses I could see contained language that was far too intimate for a future sister-in-law relationship. My hands started shaking as I picked up the phone, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The messages weren't locked behind a password screen, and I found myself scrolling through weeks of conversations that revealed a relationship I never could have imagined. The texts ranged from mundane logistical discussions about meeting locations to explicit expressions of desire and affection that made me feel physically sick. They'd been meeting regularly for months, apparently beginning shortly after my sister had moved back home. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to my chest. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at message after message that detailed not just a sexual affair, but what appeared to be a genuine emotional connection. They shared inside jokes, discussed their feelings about the deception, and even made plans for a future together that obviously didn't include me. My sister had written about feeling guilty but unable to stop, while my fiancé had expressed frustration with having to maintain the charade of our relationship while wanting to be with her instead. I heard the shower turn off and quickly placed the phone back on the nightstand, my mind racing as I tried to process what I'd discovered. When my fiancé emerged from the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist and steam following him into the bedroom, I felt like I was looking at a complete stranger. The man I'd been planning to marry, the person I'd trusted with my future, had been living a double life that involved my own sister. The casual way he picked up his phone and checked his messages, probably including new ones from her, made me want to scream. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I spent the next few days in a state of shock, going through the motions of normal life while my world crumbled internally. I showed up to work, responded to emails, and even continued wedding planning tasks like some kind of bizarre autopilot. Every interaction with my fiancé felt like performing in a play where I was the only one who didn't know the script had changed. When he kissed me goodbye in the morning or asked about my day, I wanted to shake him and demand to know how he could maintain such a convincing facade. The hardest part was facing my sister. She called me 2 days after my discovery, suggesting we meet for lunch to discuss final wedding details. I agreed, morbidly curious about how she would behave knowing what I now knew. Sitting across from her in a crowded restaurant, watching her make small talk about flower arrangements and seating charts, I felt like I was observing a master manipulator at work. She seemed genuinely engaged in wedding planning, asking detailed questions about timing and logistics for an event that would celebrate my marriage to the man she was secretly sleeping with. My sister even offered to help with last-minute preparations, volunteering to pick up decorations and coordinate with vendors. The sheer audacity of her performance was breathtaking. She looked me in the eye and talked about how excited she was to see me marry such a wonderful man, how happy she was that I'd found someone who treated me so well. I nodded along, playing my own part in this twisted theatrical production, while internally cataloging every lie and manipulation I was witnessing. That night, I confronted my fiancé with a directness that surprised even me. I walked into our living room where he was watching television and simply said that I knew about his relationship with my sister. The color drained from his face instantly, and his mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. For a moment, he looked like he might try to deny it, but something in my expression must have conveyed that I had concrete evidence. His shoulders sagged, and he turned off the television with shaking hands. His confession came in a rush of words that tumbled over each other in his desperation to explain. He claimed the affair had started innocently, just conversations and coffee meetings that gradually became more intimate. He insisted that he'd never intended for it to happen, that he'd been conflicted about his feelings for months. He said he'd been planning to call off the wedding, but hadn't figured out how to do it without destroying everyone involved. The explanations felt hollow and self-serving, focused more on his own emotional turmoil than on the devastation he'd caused. What struck me most was his apparent belief that his confession would somehow make things better, that honesty would provide a foundation for moving forward. He seemed genuinely confused when I told him that our relationship was over, that the wedding was canceled, and that I wanted him out of our shared apartment immediately. He'd apparently constructed some fantasy scenario where his guilt would be absolved through confession, and we'd all find a way to navigate this situation like mature adults. The next few days were a blur of practical devastation. I had to call the wedding venue, the caterer, the photographer, and dozens of other vendors to cancel services and attempt to recover deposits. Each phone call required me to explain that the wedding was off, though I kept the details vague and cited irreconcilable differences. The financial loss was significant, but the emotional cost of unwinding all those carefully laid plans felt even higher. I'd spent months creating a vision of our future together, and now I was systematically dismantling it piece by piece. Telling my parents was the conversation I dreaded most. They'd grown genuinely fond of my fiancé and had been looking forward to the wedding as a celebration of our family's expansion. When I finally sat them down and explained what had happened, their reactions were a mix of shock, anger, and protective concern for me. My father, usually measured and diplomatic, used language I'd rarely heard from him when discussing my sister's role in the betrayal. My mother oscillated between wanting to comfort me and wanting to drive directly to my sister's apartment to confront her. The family dynamics became impossible to navigate. My sister initially tried to contact me through various channels, sending texts and emails that ranged from defensive justifications to tearful apologies. She claimed that she'd never intended to hurt me, that her feelings for my fiancé had developed gradually and against her better judgment. She insisted that she'd been planning to end the affair and disappear from our lives, rather than continue the deception. Her messages revealed a level of self-delusion that was almost impressive in its scope. My parents struggled with how to handle the situation with my sister. As much as they were angry about her betrayal, she was still their daughter, and they couldn't simply excommunicate her from the family. They attempted to mediate conversations between us, hoping that some kind of reconciliation might be possible over time. I made it clear that I had no interest in rebuilding a relationship with someone who could maintain such an elaborate deception, while looking me in the eye and discussing my wedding plans. The social fallout was almost as difficult as the family drama. Friends who'd been invited to the wedding had to be informed of the cancellation, and many of them wanted details about what had happened. I found myself having to decide how much to reveal, balancing my desire for honesty with my need for privacy. Some friends were supportive and understanding, while others seemed to view the situation as entertainment or gossip. The way people reacted to my crisis revealed a lot about the nature of our relationships that I hadn't previously recognized. Work became my refuge during this period. I threw myself into projects with the same obsessive energy I'd previously directed toward wedding planning. My colleagues noticed the change in my demeanor, but were tactful enough not to pry too deeply. The routine of deadlines, meetings, and professional responsibilities provided a structure that helped me function, while my personal life felt completely chaotic. I started staying later at the office, partly to avoid the empty apartment and partly because work felt like the only area of my life where I still had control. Several weeks after the confrontation, I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment. My sister had apparently been calling and texting my parents, trying to arrange a meeting to discuss the situation. When those efforts failed, she decided to take a direct approach and showed up at my door unannounced. Seeing her standing in my hallway, looking nervous and determined, brought back all the anger I'd been trying to process in a more constructive way. She pushed past my initial resistance and entered my apartment, immediately launching into a prepared speech about remorse and family loyalty. She claimed that she'd ended the relationship with my ex-fiancé and was planning to move away again to give everyone space to heal. She said she understood that I might never forgive her, but she needed me to know that she'd never intended for things to go as far as they had. Her apology felt rehearsed and focused primarily on alleviating her own guilt, rather than acknowledging the full scope of damage she'd caused. What angered me most was her apparent expectation that her apology would somehow restore our relationship to its previous state. She seemed to believe that sisterly bonds were strong enough to overcome betrayal of this magnitude, that family loyalty would eventually triumph over personal hurt. She talked about childhood memories and shared experiences, as if they could somehow offset the months of deception and manipulation. Her inability to understand the permanent nature of what she'd done felt like a final insult to our relationship. During our confrontation, she revealed details about the affair that I hadn't previously known. She claimed that my ex-fiancé had been expressing doubts about our relationship for months, that he'd confided in her about feeling trapped by wedding expectations and family pressure. She painted herself as a sympathetic listener who'd gradually become something more, as if the affair had been an inevitable outcome of circumstances rather than a series of conscious choices. Her version of events positioned both of them as victims of complicated emotions rather than perpetrators of deliberate betrayal. The conversation ended with me telling her to leave and never contact me again. I made it clear that I considered our relationship permanently severed, that I had no interest in her apologies or explanations. She left my apartment crying, but I felt no sympathy for her distress. The sister I'd grown up with, the person I'd trusted with my wedding planning and family secrets, had revealed herself to be someone I didn't recognize and didn't want to know. In the following months, I began the slow process of rebuilding my life without the two people who'd been central to my world. I found a new apartment, partly to escape the memories associated with the place I'd shared with my ex-fiancé, and partly to create a space that was entirely my own. The process of moving felt symbolic, like I was literally and figuratively starting over. I donated or threw away items that reminded me of my previous life, keeping only things that felt authentically mine. The dating world felt impossible to navigate with my new understanding of how completely people could deceive those closest to them. I'd always been trusting, perhaps naively so, and the betrayal had fundamentally altered my ability to take people at face value. Every new person I met became a potential source of deception, and I found myself analyzing conversations for hidden meanings and ulterior motives. The natural progression of getting to know someone felt fraught with danger and uncertainty. My parents kept me updated on my sister's life, despite my expressed lack of interest. She'd apparently followed through on her promise to move away, relocating to another state and starting over professionally. They occasionally mentioned phone calls or messages she'd sent expressing regret and hoping for eventual reconciliation. I made it clear that I didn't want to hear these updates, that her remorse was irrelevant to my healing process. My parents struggled to understand how I could permanently write off a family member, but I'd accepted that some betrayals were unforgivable. The most unexpected challenge was dealing with mutual friends, who remained in contact with both my ex-fiancé and my sister. Some people seemed to expect that I'd eventually move past the betrayal and restore relationships with both of them. They'd make comments about forgiveness and family bonds, suggesting that my anger was understandable but ultimately self-destructive. These well-meaning observations felt like additional violations, as if my pain was somehow less valid than their discomfort with the ongoing conflict. Social media became a minefield of potential triggers. I discovered that my ex-fiancé and sister had apparently maintained their relationship after my discovery, posting photos together in various locations that suggested they were building a life together. Seeing evidence of their continued happiness, while I was still processing the devastation they'd caused, felt like additional betrayal. I eventually blocked both of them across all platforms, but the damage of those initial glimpses lingered for months. About a year after the wedding cancellation, I received an unexpected piece of information through a mutual friend. My ex-fiancé and sister had apparently gotten married in a small ceremony in the city where she'd relocated. The friend seemed unsure whether to share this news, but felt I should know in case I encountered the information elsewhere. Learning about their marriage felt like a final chapter in a story I'd been trying to close, confirmation that their relationship had been more serious than either of them had initially admitted. The news of their marriage brought up emotions I thought I'd successfully processed. Part of me felt vindicated that their relationship had been genuine rather than just a moment of weakness, but another part felt renewed anger at the deception they'd maintained while planning my own wedding. I realized that they'd been building a future together while I'd been planning what I thought was my own future, that every conversation about wedding details had been occurring while they were secretly planning their own life together. 2 years after the initial discovery, I found myself in a completely different life than the one I'd been planning. I'd changed jobs, moved to a different part of the city, and slowly begun building new relationships based on my more cautious but realistic understanding of human nature. The sharp edges of my anger had worn down to a manageable sadness, and I'd stopped checking social media for updates about my sister and ex-fiancé. The betrayal had become a part of my history rather than the defining feature of my present. Recently, I received a message from my sister through a mutual friend, indicating that she wanted to reach out about what she called important family news. My parents had mentioned that she was pregnant, and apparently she wanted to share this information with me directly. The message included her phone number and an invitation to call when I was ready to have a conversation. I stared at the piece of paper for a long time, considering whether this development changed anything about our relationship or my willingness to engage with her. The idea that my sister was starting a family with the man I'd been planning to marry brought up a complex mix of emotions I wasn't sure how to process. Part of me felt curious about their life together, wondering if they'd found the happiness they'd been seeking when they betrayed me. Another part felt a familiar anger at the presumption that her pregnancy somehow created an obligation for me to restore our relationship. The mutual friend who delivered the message seemed to expect that impending motherhood would soften my position, but I wasn't sure that biological developments changed the fundamental nature of what had happened between us. I haven't decided whether to respond to her message, and I'm not sure I ever will. The woman who'd been my closest family member for most of my life had revealed herself to be someone I couldn't trust, and no amount of time or major life events could change that reality. The betrayal had taught me that some relationships couldn't survive certain kinds of damage, that forgiveness wasn't always possible or even desirable. Whether or not she was starting a family with my ex-fiancé was ultimately irrelevant to the choices I'd made about my own life and relationships. The experience had fundamentally changed my understanding of trust, loyalty, and family bonds. I'd learned that people were capable of elaborate deceptions, even with those they claimed to love most. But I'd also discovered reserves of strength and resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. The life I'd built in the aftermath of their betrayal was smaller and perhaps more cautious than the one I'd been planning, but it was authentically mine in a way that my previous life had never been. Standing in my apartment, looking at the message from my sister, I realized that the choice of whether to respond was just another step in the ongoing process of defining who I wanted to be in the world. The betrayal had ended one version of my story, but it had also created space for a different kind of future. Whatever I decided about my sister's message, I knew that my choice would be based on my own needs and boundaries rather than on other people's expectations about forgiveness and family loyalty. The most important lesson I'd learned was that some betrayals revealed fundamental incompatibilities that couldn't be overcome through apologies or time. My sister and ex-fiancé had shown me who they really were during those months of deception, and I'd chosen to believe them. The life they'd built together was a consequence of their choices, just as the life I'd built alone was a consequence of mine. Their happiness or unhappiness was no longer my concern, and their attempts to restore relationship with me would have to be evaluated based on my own healing and growth rather than on their needs or expectations.